Land of Lincoln by Andrew Ferguson. Narrated by Patrick Lawlor. Copyright 2007. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Andrew Ferguson and writers' representatives, and was produced in the year 2007 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Preface. More books have been written about Abraham Lincoln than about any other American, nearly 14,000 in all, and at least half of those books begin by saying that more books have been written about Abraham Lincoln than about any other American. This book, you'll notice, is one of them. Yet its subject matter is not Lincoln directly or Lincoln exclusively. Its subject is really the country that Lincoln created, and around which, I think I can show, he still putters, appearing here and there in likely and unlikely places, obtruding, stirring things up, offering consolation, dispensing bromides and bits of wisdom, and otherwise making himself undeniable. So even though this is a Lincoln book, and not a book about me, sorry to disappoint you, it might help explain some things that happen in the book later on if I explain at the outset my own association with Lincoln, which runs pretty deep. I was born in a mid-sized town in northeastern Illinois, the state that sells itself, to itself among others, as the Land of Lincoln. Its convicts stamped the claim right there on the license plates. My father worked as a lawyer in Chicago, in a firm founded after the Civil War by Robert Todd Lincoln, the only one of Abraham Lincoln's sons to survive childhood. I grew up in a drafty old Victorian house on Lincoln Street, a mile or so from another drafty old Victorian where, legend has it, Lincoln himself had spent the night in the 1850s. Riding in our family's Oldsmobile as a boy, I saw this house nearly every day, turning in my seat as we passed, always picturing the tall, stooped figure climbing the front porch, removing his stovepipe hat to greet the lady of the house as he crossed the threshold into the cool of the parlor, until the Olds took the bend in the road and the house was out of sight. During the long, humid summers, on visits to grandparents and cousins downstate, my parents would sometimes break the boredom by taking my brothers and me on side trips to the state capital of Springfield, an exhausted city of liquor stores and parking lots, but to me, a place full of wonders. There, in the heat, we would run a well-worn path from the Lincoln Tomb to the restored law offices of A. Lincoln to the only home A. Lincoln ever owned, a clapboard house tucked behind a picket fence in a down-at-the-heels neighborhood not far from the Capitol building. Once or twice we drove 20 miles out of town to New Salem, the village on a bluff above the Sangamon River where Lincoln spent his young manhood. Its inhabitants abandoned New Salem long before Lincoln died, and a commemorative collection of log cabins had been rebuilt on the site a century later, as a tourist draw. Already, by the time of our first visit, the splintered logs of the new buildings had grown gray and brittle from the weather, taking on the faded look of historical artifacts themselves. Our Lincoln diversions climaxed in a long car trip the family took one bright, blissful week along the then new and soon-to-be defunct Lincoln Heritage Trail. Having been where he'd been and walked where he'd walked, I became a Lincoln buff, junior division, privileged to indulge, I thought, in a special intimacy with greatness. I cleared my schedule, not so hard to do when you're 10, whenever Abe Lincoln in Illinois or young Mr. Lincoln was to show up on TV. My favorite book was a photographic album as thick and heavy as a plank of oak called Lincoln in Every Known Pose. My second favorite was a yearling children's book called Abraham Lincoln by Ingrid and Edgar Dolaire, a beautifully illustrated biography whose only defect was that it ended before his dark and splendidly heartbreaking death. Photographs of Lincoln hung on the walls of my bedroom. Sometimes at night, wakened by a bad dream, I'd rise from my bed and go to my desk and pull from the center drawer a sheaf of papers written in Lincoln's own hand. I'd bought a packet of these yellowed, crinkly reproductions, reeking of the rust-colored dye that was meant to make them look antique, at a cavernous gift shop near his birthplace. The words carried the force of an incantation, entrancing, if not, to me, thoroughly comprehensible. By the light of the desk lamp I'd read The Letter to Mrs. Bixby, or the last paragraph of the Second Inaugural, the one beginning, "With malice toward none." I memorized the Gettysburg Address and his sublime farewell to the people of Springfield. What I mean is, I had a great deal of Abraham Lincoln growing up. I was a buff, and I was not alone. And then I wasn't a buff anymore. The country had undergone a Lincoln boom in the early 1960s, following the 150th anniversary of his birth and coinciding with the centennial celebrations of the Civil War. And not long after the centennial passed, my interest in Lincoln waned too. On my bedroom walls, Lincoln was replaced by the Beatles, who were themselves replaced in a few years by the languid Susan Day. Every known pose sat stoutly on the shelf, unconsulted, passing eventually to a box in my parents' garage, doomed. I don't know what happened to it, or to the sheaf of Lincoln papers. I seldom recalled Springfield or New Salem. Something similar was happening in the country at large, I think. The great historical amnesia, certified and lamented nowadays by professional educators and tut-tutters of all kinds, was just settling in. Fewer and fewer courses in American history were taught less and less frequently, and those that survived were recast as exercises in multicultural special pleading or litanies of political grievance. The tut-tutters took surveys and compiled the sad data of what has come to be called historical illiteracy. Fully two-thirds of graduating high school seniors can't name the half-century in which the Civil War was fought. Another third can't identify Thomas Jefferson. 65% think Stonewall Jackson was a bass player for the Funkadelics, and so on. Historical tourism, another marker, declined too. The historian Barry Schwartz checked the figures and found a steady decline in attendance at Lincoln sites from the 1960s to the end of the century. More than 1 million people a year visited New Salem in the mid-60s, for example. 20 years later, the number was reduced by half. But more than simple amnesia was at work. There was something willful in the forgetting. Americans, particularly the well-off and over-schooled, were entering a wised-up era, where skepticism about the country, its heroes, and its history was a mark of worldliness and sophistication. The historian C. Van Woodward called this loss of innocence, if that's what it was, the fall of the American atom. Even in Springfield, which clings to Lincoln's memory like a rosary, road signs that directed tourists to the Lincoln shrines were replaced by signs listing the Lincoln sites. I recall one episode in particular from the 1970s. Talking after class one day, a college friend and I discovered that we had both been buffs as boys, both enthralled to the same Lincoln children's book by the Dolaires. I mentioned the climactic scene in which young Abe witnesses a slave auction and announces, "Someday I'm going to hit that, and I'm going to hit it hard." "Yeah," my friend said, "what a load of crap." Historians had discovered that the incident was wholly fictitious, he said, a fantasy. In fact, Lincoln had been as much a racist as Jefferson Davis. His official policy as president was to ship the slaves back to Africa. The Emancipation Proclamation was a cynical, empty act that didn't free the slaves Lincoln could have freed, and freed, here his fingers wiggled in air quotes, only those that were out of his reach. All this was, he said, common knowledge, and in the face of it I realized that the very thought of being a buff indicated a hopeless lack of sophistication, the mark not only of an ignoramus, but of a dweeb. You might as well wear a pocket protector and high-water pants. Of course, Lincoln didn't fall from the nation's esteem altogether. We can't shake him. Indeed, he's fared better than many other of our traditional heroes. He's still on the penny, for one thing. You can still find discussion groups and clubs devoted to him in many large and mid-sized cities, and you can subscribe to half a dozen periodicals with names like the Lincoln Herald and the Rail Splitter. The books continue to pile up. Occasionally one or two of these will prove popular. Doris Kearns Goodwin's Lincoln book was a bestseller in 2005 and may even serve as the basis of a movie by Steven Spielberg. But you can't help noticing in most of the Lincoln books an air of narrow self-justification, a wan parochialism. Mario Cuomo, the politician, published a polemic called Why Lincoln Matters, proving that if Lincoln were alive today, his political views would be pretty much indistinguishable from Mario Cuomo's. The gifted journalist Joshua Wolf Schenck, who has struggled with clinical depression, wrote Lincoln's Melancholy, proving that the key to Lincoln's achievements was his struggle with clinical depression. Most memorably of all, in 2005, a sex researcher and gay rights activist named C.A. Tripp published The Intimate World of Abraham Lincoln in hopes of proving that Lincoln was an active homosexual. The point being, as another activist put it, he's ours. For a century or more, generations of Americans were taught to be like Lincoln, forbearing, kind, principled, resolute. But what we've really wanted is for Lincoln to be like us, and this has never been truer than the present day. Lincoln hasn't been forgotten, but he's shrunk. From the enormous figure of the past, he's been reduced to a hobbyist's eccentricity, a charming obsession shared by a self-selected subculture, like quilting or Irish step dancing. He has been detached from the national patrimony, if we can be said to have a national patrimony any longer. He is no longer our common possession. That earlier Lincoln, that large Lincoln, seems to be slipping away, a misty figure, incapable of rousing a reaction from anyone but buffs. Or that's what I had assumed, anyway. Then, one wintry morning a while back, I fetched the local paper from the front stoop and saw a headline, Lincoln Statue Stirs Outrage in Richmond. I thought, Lincoln? Outrage? And I felt the first stirrings of the fatal question, the question that, once raised, never lets go. Huh? I took off for Richmond a week later. I spent a lot of time there off and on, long enough to see the statue unveiled and to imbibe the outrage in deep drafts. The chapter that follows this preface, When Lincoln Came Back to Richmond, is the result. I left Richmond convinced that I was at the beginning of a story rather than at its end. I decided to keep looking for Lincoln. Richmond did something else to me, too. My time among the Lincoln haters and the briefer time I spent with the Lincoln operators who had commissioned and financed the statue made me uncomfortably aware of how little I really knew about Lincoln, and made me wonder, more to the point, how we know what we think we know about Lincoln. How was it that a single historical figure and a single set of historical facts could inspire such wildly divergent views held with equal certitude by seemingly sensible people? So the first place I went looking for Lincoln was in books, and in one book in particular. There I discovered a wild and woolly character, the overworked phrase is perfectly appropriate, who stands as godfather to every Lincoln buff, and to every Lincoln hater, too. Learning the story of Billy Herndon constituted a kind of refresher course in Lincoln studies, which I happily pass on in Chapter 2. Then I started moving again, and didn't really stop till I reached the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and this is where, conveniently enough, I wind up in Chapter 10. The curiosity that pushed me along was part personal and part professional, which accounts, I suppose, for the strange commingling in what follows. Lincoln means a lot to me. He means a lot to the country, or he should if he no longer does. By the end of my travels, I was more convinced of that truth than I'd been since I was a boy, reading beneath a pool of light in a darkened bedroom on Lincoln Street. Chapter 1. When Lincoln Came Back to Richmond. Abraham Lincoln, with his son Tad in tow, walked around Richmond, Virginia one day in April 1865, and if you try to retrace their steps today, you won't see much that they saw, which shouldn't be a surprise, of course. The street grid is the same, though, and if you're in the right mood and know what to look for, the lineaments of the earlier city begin to surface, like the outline of a scuttled old scow rising through the shallows of a pond. Among the tangle of freeway interchanges and office buildings, you'll come across an overgrown park, or a line of red brick townhouses, an unlikely old bell tower, or a few churches scattered from block to block, dating to the decades before the Civil War and still giving off vibrations from long ago. Richmond rests on a group of hills above a bend in the James River. Along the riverbank at the east end of town, where Lincoln began his tour that day, is a long rank of tobacco warehouses, abandoned now, and from behind them the land rises steeply through the commercial district for perhaps half a mile. The Capitol, built from a design by Thomas Jefferson in the 18th century, sits on the crest of the hill, and back of it, 7 blocks away, is a Georgian mansion that served as the White House of the Confederacy, official residence of President Jefferson Davis. Walk due west from there past the parking lots, through the plaza surrounding the new glass and concrete convention center, and then head south, and before too long you're back at the riverbank, at the ruins of the Tredegar Iron Works, where the cannon and shot were forged that sustained the South through 4 years of rebellion. No one knows for sure whether Lincoln and Tad visited Tredegar, or whether they passed by the ironworks during a carriage ride they took later the same day, but they're there now, so a romantic would say, in the form of a bronze statue. The statue, showing both father and son, was installed in April 2003 at the headquarters of the National Park Service's Richmond Civil War Battlefield Park, which is housed in Tredegar's surviving buildings. In the months leading to its unveiling, the statue created a controversy that reached far beyond Richmond, beyond the United States even, to become an object of international interest. Improbably enough, during that season when the world's attention was diverted by another war looming in Iraq. One Richmond official traveling through Barbados a few months before the statue arrived picked up a newspaper on an excursion plane. "Lincoln comes to Confederate capital," read the headline on the back page. What made the controversy newsworthy was that there should be a controversy at all. Members of the Richmond establishment, the businessmen, journalists, politicians, rich people, and other well-wired doers of public good who unanimously supported the statue as both a tourist attraction and a statement of civic virtue, were caught unawares. It came as a surprise to them, as it had to me, that anyone should find a tribute to the 16th president so objectionable. Who could object to Lincoln? He seems too big even to have an opinion about. It would be like objecting to the moon. Yet many people do object, as Richmond's big shots discovered, and these Abe-phobes, it turns out, are almost always well-spoken and well-read and, in percentage terms, not much crazier than the general population that tends to accept Lincoln's presence as a fact of life. When I first visited Richmond, a month before the statue's unveiling, and 2 months after I read the story in the Washington Post, I went to see Bragdon Bowling, who had been stoking the controversy like a steam engine. Bowling popped up in every story I read. He was gathering petitions, setting up websites, pestering politicians with mail and phone calls, and encouraging others to do the same. He had enlisted Thomas DiLorenzo, the author of a recently published anti-Lincoln book called The Real Lincoln, to help him gather scholars and authors for a public conference with the title Lincoln Reconsidered, to lay out his case as soberly and comprehensively as possible. This was his sworn duty. Bowling is division commander of the Army of Northern Virginia Sons of Confederate Veterans, and at those moments when he decides that the heritage of the South is being abused, as it was with the placement of a Lincoln statue in the former capital of the Confederacy, he becomes an agitator ex officio. "It's a responsibility you have," he said. "You've got to try to stop it." He's a tall man with a scholarly air, due largely to an unruly shock of white hair and the wire spectacles that are always slipping down his nose. I met him in the stripped-down living room of one of the rental properties he owns in a working-class suburb north of Richmond. He had to repaint the place, and it was covered in tarps. "Sometimes you end up renting to people who simply do not know how to keep house," he said. He turned a paint tub upside down and sat on it, and gestured for me to sit on a butt-sprung couch across from him. Bowling said he was a native of Virginia, but of Arlington, Virginia, which many native Virginians consider less a part of the Commonwealth than a satellite of Washington, D.C., or worse, liberal Maryland, with all its inevitable corruptions. "It's a zoo now, but it wasn't so bad then," he said of his hometown. "I got a good education. See, you could still do that in those days. I got taught the usual liberal history, but my teachers were smart people who had high standards. They taught me to think for myself, and that's what I've done. 10 years ago, I started to learn about my family. I read intensively everything I could, not just politically correct history, but also other history that's been suppressed. That's the way this learning process often starts. My great-grandfather served in the Army of Northern Virginia as a private under General Robert E. Lee. He was at Sharpsburg, Yankees call it Antietam, at Chancellorsville, other places, and like 90% of the soldiers who fought for and served the South, he never owned a slave. So, just to show you how the thought process works for people who are still capable of thinking for themselves, so I thought, well, why is that? If the war is all about slavery, why is he fighting so hard? It didn't fit, you see, with everything I'd been taught about the Civil War. Like all his comrades, my great-grandfather gave everything he had. Why? He did it for his country. The South had bad everything, bad munitions, bad clothing, bad food, but they had the best men. They gave everything they had, and they did not do that to defend slavery. The war wasn't about slavery for Lincoln either, Bowling explained. He ticked off the particulars of his indictment of Lincoln. With his generals, he invented the concept of total war and waged campaigns of unprecedented savagery against non-combatants and private property in the Shenandoah Valley, Sherman's march through Georgia, and elsewhere. He was the father of big government, vastly expanding the reach of Imperial Washington in ways unthinkable to the country's founders. The Northern victory was therefore the triumph of a cosmopolitan, commercial culture controlled by big business over a Southern culture of farms and small towns that asked only to be let alone. It was all about power, he said, 600,000 dead. All so Lincoln and his friends could consolidate their power to tell other people how to live their lives. What Bowling learned inspired him to join the Sons of Confederate Veterans. He rose through the ranks, and it was in his capacity as division commander that he received a phone call one winter evening from a reporter for the Richmond Times-Dispatch. "This reporter says to me he wants a comment on the statue of Lincoln they're going to put up in Richmond." I said, "Huh?" He said, "Yeah, a fellow named Bob Klein has donated a statue of Lincoln, and they're going to put it up down at the Visitor Center at Tredegar. You got a comment?" Well, I knew right away what was going on here, and I told him so. This is the latest move in a scheme to demonize the Confederate soldier. The Park Service, the politicians, the politically correct historians, they've been doing this all across the country, and now they're doing it right here in Richmond. I said a statue of Lincoln didn't sound to me like it was demonizing anybody. To worship Lincoln right here is an insult to the Confederate soldier, he said. There are 40,000 graves of Confederate soldiers in this city, and I will defend their honor. You see, unlike the politicians and these others, I'm a student of history. I know what this man Lincoln did to this country. I know what the army under his command did to the South. You ever wonder why there are no statues of Abraham Lincoln in the entire southern half of the United States? It's pretty simple. People here remember what he did. Used to be, everybody here remembered. Now only some of us do. 3 times during our interview, Bowling was interrupted with phone calls from reporters, including one from the Times of London, seeking comment on one aspect or another of the controversy. He answered them all with a patient repetition of well-rehearsed sound bites. "It is an insult to the Confederate soldier," he said. After the 3rd call, I got up to leave and he walked me outside. The pickup in the driveway had an old NRA sticker peeling from its bumper. "Charlton Heston is my president." "This thing is not over yet," he said. "There are a lot of people upset over this, and they may still have a few tricks up their sleeves." I asked him if he meant someone was planning to prevent the statue from going in. "If there's anything violent or what have you that happens, the sons of Confederate veterans will have no part in that," he said. "People do feel strongly, but the statue will go in," he said. "Probably." He laughed. "Unless it doesn't." While he was alive, Abraham Lincoln was one of the most intensely hated public figures the country has ever known. The minute he got shot, however, things began looking up for him. Colleagues and subordinates who had considered him dithering or imperious in life fell into inconsolable and very public mourning at word of his death. Political enemies who had prayed for his demise suddenly saw a figure of inviolable moral integrity, far-seeing competence, unsearchable wisdom. The historian Merrill Peterson, in his great book Lincoln in American Memory, cites the instance of Henry Ward Beecher, the abolitionist preacher in Brooklyn, who for 4 years had lacerated Lincoln from his pulpit for timidity and hesitation in the face of Southern barbarism. Then came John Wilkes Booth, and Lincoln was dead, and when the body passed through New York on its way to the cemetery in Springfield, Illinois, the old blowhard ascended the same pulpit and became the martyred president's foremost eulogist. "Dead, dead, dead, he yet speaketh," Beecher said. "4 years ago, O Illinois, we took from your midst an untried man. We return him to you a conqueror. Not thine any more, but the nation's. Not ours, but the world's. Give him place, ye prairies." Everyone was ready to give him place. So quickly and so thoroughly did his countrymen exalt him that casuists everywhere found it profitable to enlist his memory. A teetotaler in life, for instance, Lincoln became, once he was safely dead, 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 an unsilenceable advocate of national temperance, or so claimed the Dries of the national temperance movement, which distributed millions of copies of a speech he had made on the subject early in his career. The Dries pressed their Lincoln Association for decades, until historians employed by Adolphus Busch, partner of Anheuser and father of Budweiser, discovered a yellowing liquor license that had been issued in the 1830s to a small prairie grocer by the name of Abraham Lincoln. Busch made sure that reproductions of Lincoln's license soon hung on the wall of every tavern in America. They stayed there, consoling drinkers, until the tragic triumph of the Dries in 1919. By that time, Lincoln had been dragooned into causes far more implausible than temperance. On the centennial of his birth, in 1909, the nation's leading white supremacist, a senator from Mississippi named James K. Vardaman, made an unironical pilgrimage to Springfield and claimed the immortal Lincoln as his inspiration. "My views and his views," he said later on the Senate floor, "are substantially identical." He would have got an argument probably from the American Communist Party, which throughout the 1930s put on an annual Lincoln-Lenin Day festival and festooned its Harlem headquarters with his likeness. Americans laid claim to his spiritual life, too. To his friends, Lincoln appeared to be a man of few and ambiguous religious beliefs. He quoted the Bible often, but he never joined a church, and when he ran for president, every pastor in Springfield pointedly refused to endorse him. Yet when his soul took flight, it was lassoed by every Protestant denomination simultaneously. Unitarians took him as their own, and so, later on, did the Christian Scientists, even though the science of divine healing was not revealed to Mary Baker Eddy until a year after Lincoln's death. In 1891, the famed, at the time, seer Nettie Colburn Maynard published a long study called "Was Abraham Lincoln a Spiritualist?" She answered her question with an emphatic yes, describing dinner parties during the Civil War at which the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?